Why the German army collapsed faster than anyone expected. In December 1944, the German army launched one of the largest offensives of the entire war. 500,000 men, thousands of tanks. A surprise attack through the Ardennes forest that caught the Allies completely off guard. 8 weeks later, that same army would cease to exist. Not retreat, not surrender in organized fashion, but vanish, collapsing so rapidly that Allied commanders stood in disbelief as entire army groups simply dissolved before their eyes. Soldiers abandoned their weapons. Officers fled their posts. Units that had fought for years evaporated in days. The question isn't why Germany lost the war. By 1945, everyone knew that answer. The question is why an army that had conquered most of Europe collapsed faster than any military force in modern history. The answer lies in decisions made months earlier. Decisions driven by ego, delusion, and a refusal to accept reality until reality itself became inescapable. To understand the collapse, you have to go back to July 1944. Operation Bagration. While the world focused on D-Day, the Soviet Union launched the largest offensive in human history against German Army Group Center in Belarus. In 3 weeks, the Soviets destroyed 28 German divisions. Over 400,000 German soldiers killed or captured. An entire army group simply ceased to exist. The Wehrmacht never recovered from Bagration. Every experienced officer, every veteran soldier lost in that catastrophe could never be replaced. From that moment forward, the German army was fighting with borrowed time, using soldiers who barely knew how to fire their weapons. But Hitler refused to acknowledge what had happened, refused to adjust strategy. Instead, he demanded counterattacks and victories that existed only in his imagination. The men who might have told him the truth were either dead, dismissed, or had learned that honesty was more dangerous than the enemy. After the July 20th assassination attempt, Hitler trusted no one in the traditional military establishment. The Wehrmacht was no longer run by generals. It was run by political fanatics who measured their words more carefully than their strategies. The army continued fighting, not because victory was possible, but because admitting defeat was unthinkable. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last strategic reserve spent on a fantasy. Hitler conceived it in total secrecy. The plan was operationally absurd. Punch through the Allied line, drive to Antwerp, split the British and American armies, and force a negotiated peace in the West. His generals tried to object. Field Marshal von Rundstedt called it a damned fool enterprise to his staff. They proposed more limited objectives, something achievable. Hitler dismissed every objection. The attack would proceed exactly as planned. The offensive required fuel the army didn't have. It required air superiority Germany had lost a year earlier. It required veteran troops that existed only on paper. Most critically, it required the Allies to do nothing while German forces drove hundreds of miles through enemy territory. For 72 hours, the plan actually worked. Surprise was total. American units broke and fled. Hitler seemed vindicated. But then reality reasserted itself. The weather cleared. Allied air power returned and turned German supply columns into burning wreckage. Key positions held most famously Bastogne, where surrounded American troops refused to surrender. The fuel depots Germany needed to capture were already evacuated. By early January, the offensive had failed. Germany had committed its last strategic reserves to an operation designed to win the war. Instead, it left the Eastern Front naked. The Soviets were watching and preparing. On the 12th of January 1945, the Soviet Union launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers, 7,000 tanks, more artillery than existed in the entire German army. They struck against a German defense that was more concept than reality. Divisions existed on paper with strength numbers that bore no relation to the exhausted, understrength units holding the line. The front didn't hold. It shattered. In 2 weeks, Soviet forces advanced 300 miles. German units simply ceased to function. Soldiers fled west, desperate to escape the Red Army, and reach territory where they might surrender to the Americans or British. Hitler still commanded from Berlin, moving imaginary divisions on maps, issuing orders to units that no longer existed, demanding counterattacks from armies that had already disintegrated. The road to Berlin lay open. Armies don't fight on courage alone. They fight on fuel, ammunition, and food. By February 1945, the Wehrmacht had none of these things. Allied bombing had destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production. The tanks Germany still possessed couldn't move. The trucks couldn't transport supplies. The aircraft couldn't fly. Without fuel, mechanized warfare becomes impossible. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe through speed and mobility, was now fighting like an army from 1,918. Horses pulled artillery. Infantry marched because there was no transport. But it was worse than simply lacking supplies. The transportation network itself was collapsing. Allied air forces controlled the skies completely. Anything that moved during daylight was destroyed. Trains couldn't run. Supply dumps were bombed the moment they were identified. What supplies did exist couldn't reach the front lines. Units starved not because food didn't exist, but because it couldn't be delivered. And hungry men don't hold defensive positions when they can walk west and surrender to an army that will feed them. By March 1945, every German soldier knew the war was lost. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine in the west. Germany itself was being bombed into rubble. For soldiers on the Eastern Front, there was an additional nightmare. They knew what awaited them if they fell into Soviet hands. The Red Army was fighting for revenge. Surrendering to the Soviets meant almost certain death in a labor camp. The only rational choice was to retreat west and surrender to the Anglo-American forces. So that's what happened. Entire divisions simply abandoned their positions and fled west. Not in organized retreats, in panicked flight. Officers who tried to stop them were ignored or shot. Hitler issued increasingly deranged orders, declared every city a fortress to be held to the last man, demanded counterattacks that existed only in his mind. He fired generals by the dozen. None of it mattered. The army had stopped listening. Commands from Berlin were received and ignored. The Wehrmacht had become a ghost army existing on paper but absent from the battlefield. History often portrays the final months as a period of fanatical resistance. Hitler Youth fighting in the rubble. SS units holding out when everyone else had surrendered. These stories are true, but they're misleading. They were the exception, not the rule. For every SS battalion that fought fanatically in Berlin, there were a dozen Wehrmacht divisions that simply ceased to resist. For every Hitler Youth with anti-tank weapons, there were thousands of regular soldiers walking west with their hands raised. American forces in the West were astonished at how quickly German resistance crumbled. They'd been told to expect fanatic defense. Instead, they found soldiers eager to surrender. Towns declared themselves undefended. White flags appeared before Allied troops even arrived. The Soviets experienced something different in the East. German troops fought harder against them not out of fanaticism but terror. They knew what Soviet captivity meant, so they fought to delay long enough for civilians to flee and for soldiers to slip away west. Most German soldiers stopped fighting because they saw no reason to die for a cause that was already dead. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht existed only in Hitler's imagination. The Battle of Berlin was less a battle than a massacre. Soviet forces surrounded the city with overwhelming force. But the defenders weren't an army. They were fragments, remnants of destroyed units, old men with outdated rifles, foreign SS volunteers with nowhere else to go, and indoctrinated teenagers who believed sacrifice was glorious. They held for 2 weeks, not because they were winning, because urban warfare is inherently slow. But the end was never in doubt. German forces in the West were surrendering en masse. Entire divisions marched into captivity without firing a shot. The Western Allies found themselves with more prisoners than they could process. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, the pretense ended. His successor had one priority: surrender to the Western Allies as quickly as possible, while keeping the Eastern Front engaged long enough for maximum numbers of soldiers and civilians to reach Anglo-American lines. On the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. But the German army had effectively ceased to exist weeks earlier.